Thanks, Tim, for joining in this conversation around Japan's startup ecosystem. You've been running your podcast, Disrupting Japan, for a while, and which provides a lot of insights into what's happening within the Japanese market and industry per se. So, in that regard, it's really a pleasure to have you in this conversation.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Right, wonderful. So, you've been involved with Japan's startup ecosystem for decades, both as a founder and then through your podcast. So, how would you describe the current phase of the Japan startup ecosystem, and how is it different from earlier cycles that you may have observed?
I It's a really good question. I think it really depends on what you're comparing it to. So if you try to compare what's happening in Tokyo to what's happening in San Francisco, it seems like things are developing very slowly and it's far behind, but it's not a fair comparison. San Francisco is this unique place. If you compare the Japan startup ecosystem today to where it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, it's much easier to see substantive progress that's being made. So, for example, I'd say some of the most important things that are happening right now is, not only the availability of capital, but the openness of large Japanese enterprises to working with startups. So, when I started my first startup here in Japan, it was back in the dot-com era. And it was almost impossible to work with large Japanese companies. You couldn't get through the vendor certification process, and you'd be pushed down through like 4 layers of subcontractors, and you can't do anything innovative that way. But today, like every major company in Japan has a team of people that are focused on working with startups and trying to incorporate startup innovation. I think those kind of things are have a much bigger impact on the Japanese startup ecosystem than necessarily just the amount of yen that's being invested into the startups, although that's important as well.
Right. So, do you see, with there being increasing global attention on events like Sushi Tech Tokyo and a broader Tokyo innovation ecosystem, do you see this as a genuine inflection point, or is it, part of a longer, more gradual evolution?
I think it's part of a larger trend, and I think it is. I think perhaps the most important thing about events like Sushi Tech, or I would say Sushi Tech specifically, is the signaling from the government and from these large enterprises that startups have become mainstream and accepted in Japan. And that sort of signaling in Japan is very important. In fact, I think perhaps one of the biggest inflection points in terms of startups being considered like legitimate and important in Japan was when former Prime Minister Abe, in a televised address, talked about startups being the future of Japan and important for, Japan's economic progress. And I have no doubt that the next day, every CEO in Japan was talking to his staff saying, like, what are these startup things and why aren't we working with them? So that kind of waving the flag is extremely important and it's had a huge impact. And I think Sushi Tech kind of continues in that tradition of the government and large industry signaling the importance of startups.
So, you mentioned about your experience during the dot-com era, and now you're talking about large enterprises and the government taking note of startups. But on the ground, has it made a difference? Have any of these large enterprises, because you see that in other markets, right? Even in Southeast Asia, even in Singapore, where some large enterprises do kind of step in and kind of incubate some of the startups or new technology that they want to. They probably would not be able to develop internally. So, do you see some concrete action happening there? Are there any instances?
Absolutely. I've worked with both TEPCO and JERA, who are two of Japan's largest energy utilities, to help them spin up their CVC divisions. And there is a genuine interest in collaboration and in M&A. And I think there's one really interesting and somewhat unique aspect of the Japanese startup ecosystem is that there are these long-term partnerships that go on between startups and enterprise that I don't see in the US. There's much more of a collaborative relationship here than there is in the US, which is much more, competitive. So with a relatively small stake in a company, major enterprises will take big risks on them brand wise, So I think that is, and the startup ecosystem is evolving a bit differently because of that.
One of the recurring themes in your conversations, in your podcast also, is around Japan's culture, which often values stability and consensus. Now, how does this kind of influence founder behavior and risk taking compared to markets like the US?
I think it is true. I think when you look at risk-taking behavior, there's definitely a cultural component, but I think the cultural component is much smaller than people usually assume. I think it's just a rational analysis of risks and rewards. So, like we talked about in the 90s, in the dot-com era, there were very few startups, a small handful of them. And now there are thousands. It's just a normal career path these days, and that's wonderful. But that doesn't mean the Japanese culture has changed or the risk-taking culture has changed. I mean, maybe it has a little bit, but it's more that the risks and rewards have changed. So back in the 90s, it was very risky to start a startup. There was not a lot of risk capital available. Bankruptcy laws were much stricter than they are now. It was very hard to get a job if you failed at a startup. And all that's changed now. There's a lot of risk capital available. There is an acceptance of a failure of starting again. Now that needs to be improved, but it's much better than it was 30 years ago. And so I think people are making the rational decision to respond to these new risks and rewards and start startups. And if you want to change a culture, change the risks and rewards, change the incentives, right? And so that's what I think we're seeing. We're seeing people responding rationally to new incentives that are in place now.
What's been the role of foreign founders in this change that you are seeing? I mean, do you see more foreign founders coming into the market? Is that also kind of a trigger for this change in Japanese startup culture, and how significant is
So
this shift?
I think that, I mean, if you look at startup ecosystems around the world, foreign entrepreneurs have an outsized role in all of them. I mean, San Francisco, certainly, Indian entrepreneurs have a huge impact in San Francisco. And Japan as well. The foreign entrepreneurs here have an outsized impact compared to their population on innovation and startups here. And I don't know, maybe that's just because people who are willing to like move across the world are just more naturally open-minded and less risk averse than most people, or maybe it's just a people are bringing different insights into the market. But I think that it's an incredibly important component in any startup ecosystem, and it's very much happening here too.
So, in that context, for international founders and investors looking at Japan through platforms like Sushi Tech, I mean, what are the most common misconceptions about building or scaling a business there? And what are the typical stereotypes?
So I think if you're looking at scaling in Japan, whether you're an investor looking at corporate strategy or a startup that's coming into Japan, I think the most common mistake is just kind of assuming that the US playbook will work here in Japan. And rarely, it rarely does. And it's not just things like the sales cycles are longer and things like that, but it's just the acceptance of doing something doing something new is good, but doing something that's unproven or might be seen as pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable is really frowned upon. And like Uber and Airbnb ran into these problems when they tried to come into the market. So I think the biggest single mistake I'd have to say would be just assuming that what works in the home market will work here. Most of it will. 90% of it'll work just like it does at home, but that 10%, you've got to be very careful about.
Is language a big barrier for foreign founders in Japan?
I think it is. It's something that you have to if you don't speak Japanese, you're gonna have an awfully hard time selling to Japanese customers. And, Japanese VCs are naturally very skeptical about, well, like, well, how are you going to execute? You know? Most successful foreign founders here either do speak Japanese or they've got a Japanese speaking partner, or, they even if it's not a Japanese speaking co-founder, they have strong support within the team. But yeah, that's essential. You can't be successful in a market without being able to speak the language. You can't just do sales that way.
What are your views on the Japanese venture capital ecosystem? I mean, beyond the usual private equity investors and venture capital companies, do you see family offices? I mean, you mentioned about large corporations supporting startups. So, in that context, do you also see large family offices kind of taking interest in investing into startups?
There definitely is, but, family offices in Japan don't play as large a role as they do in the US or in Europe. So corporate venture capital plays a much larger role in Japan than in the US or Europe, but corporate venture capital in Japan very rarely leads. So it plays a large role in terms of the total amount invested in startups, but they're often not the ones making the decisions. They're being used to fill out a round. So they're an important influence, but they function a little differently here than they do in the US. Also, university funds are playing a much bigger role here in Japan than almost anywhere else in the world. Now, some of those are government funded or uh, private public partnership type investment funds. But on the seed stage, there's a huge number of universities that have funds, and not only the big ones like, Todai's, UTech, and things like that, but there's a lot most universities will have a startup fund that they're using to seed and develop these startups internally.
So, as the startup system, kind of evolves, do you see a lot of these startups also taking, I mean, that kind of changing the outlook towards sustainability, climate change, or even for that matter, gender inclusion? Because some of the areas where, typically there have been some stereotypes around these with Japan.
Yeah, I think I've had very different answers for the gender inclusion and for the climate tech. So on the gender inclusion, I think absolutely yes. I think that a lot of the women who've been on my show have made it very clear that the startup being a startup founder is attractive because there aren't any of these artificial barriers. If you can execute well, if you're good at what you can do, if you can sell, great, you're judged on your results. There is still, discrimination against women on the financing. It's harder, but it isn't a very attractive career path for a lot of ambitious women in Japan. And I think that the success in that area is, you know, anytime you see successes, anytime you can hold up a role model or a case study, that makes things better, right? You know, those ripple effects go out into society pretty quickly. In terms of the climate tech, this is something that's like it almost breaks my heart. So I've worked with in energy with two different funds, and we've made some climate focused investments, but the fact is it's extremely difficult to design a profitable, scalable business that's actually doing good in that sector. The ones that have the biggest impact tend to be very specific improvements that are developed by like industry insiders to improve the technology, to decrease emissions, to do things like that. The biggest impacts on environment tend to be in response to government regulation that opens up an area, an avenue for startup innovation to run into. When regulations change, it'll take the big companies a few years to prepare for it. And that gives a wonderful opportunity for startups to innovate quickly and to get ready, get out ahead of the changes. But it's a hard space for startups to play in.
So, Japan historically has had, strong capabilities in areas of robotics, manufacturing, and deep technology. How do you see these strengths translating into new globally competitive startups, particularly in areas like AI and you mentioned climate tech and even urban systems for that matter?
I think so. One of the most important trends that's developing right now is on how these university funds and these universities are using startups to spin out some of this core IP, to deploy some of this deep tech ideas. Because Japan has, absolutely world-class research, but it is not good at productizing that, at turning them into startups. And a lot of people are trying to crack that code. I don't think anyone's really figured it out just yet, but it's a lot of very smart people are putting a lot of effort into it. And it's one of the things I'm most optimistic about, something to watch that's going to change. Um, and that covers a lot of areas, particularly things like bioscience, the life sciences, material science, a lot of the deep tech areas. There's just some fantastic research going on. In AI and robotics, Japan has some very unique areas in physical AI. In the actual AI right now, I think the whole world is kind of trying to catch up to the US and China in terms of this current generation of AI, the large language models. Also, in terms of robotics, I mean, Japan still is way out ahead in terms of industrial robots and process robots, but the sort of next generation of robots, both the humanoid and the industrial ones that are coming out of China, I think is going to be a very real threat to Japanese dominance here. That said, there's a lot more to robots than the hardware. And so I think that robotics in general, over the next 10 or 15 years, the industry is going to look radically different 10 years from now than it does today. Now, predicting exactly how that's going to be is a lot harder, but there are so many things in flux right now. It's an incredibly exciting time.
What about the automobile industry? I mean, there was a time when Japan was with the Hondas and Toyotas leading the world, but now with electric vehicles, the dominance seems to be shifting completely towards China. So
I,
where
I
does
think
Japan view on that?
I think Japan's auto industry really is an inflection point right now. I think so. Japan made really big bets on hydrogen back around, in the early 2000s. And, at the time, perfectly good bet. Nobody knew battery costs were going to drop by 95% and energy density was going to increase by whatever it was, sixfold. So, good bet at the time. They held on to it much longer than they should have. So, yeah, Japan's automakers are pretty far behind in EVs, despite the fact that, like, the Nissan Leaf was the first really successful commercial electric car. But right now, Toyota, Honda, they're gearing up. I think they're very serious about getting into the EVs, but I think right now the Japanese auto industry is playing catch up on that. We'll see whether they can catch up. Now, that said, you know, they know how to make cars. The rest of it, if you get away from the powertrain, still some exceptional engineering. It's a interesting time for the Japanese automakers, and it's such an important industry for Japan. So I think a lot hangs on how Japan's big automakers, whether they actually come out in front or whether they're, you know, playing catch up for years.
Right. Wonderful. So as we go into Sushi Tech Tokyo this year, and with so many startups, investors, and policymakers gathering there, what are the things? What are, let's say, three things that you're going to look forward to at this year's edition? Is there anything specific that you're looking out for?
Well, actually, for me personally, I'm looking at the collaborations between the enterprises and the startups because a lot of the big exhibitors at Sushi Tech are the big Japanese conglomerates, the banks, the major enterprises in Japan. And the types of collaborations they're doing, the types of investments they're doing is a really good indicator of what they see as their future strategy, where they're headed. So that's what I'm personally going to be really looking at. But it's a great event. There's so much going on there.
Wonderful, Tim. Thanks very much. So I look forward to meeting you in Tokyo, at maybe on the sidelines of the event. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
Likewise. So look forward to talking with you soon.
Yeah. Thank you.